Hello, everyone. I'm delighted and honored to present Professor Hindy Najman. Professor Najman is Oriel and Lang Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture at the University of Oxford, aka Oxford University. And I'll mention just two of her books. 2009, Second in Sinai, The Development of Mosaic Discourse in Second Temple Judaism, and 2014, Losing the Temple and Recovering the Future, an Analysis of Fourth Ezra at Oxford University Press. And she's now currently working on a new book entitled Reading Practices and the Vitality of Scripture. So that's the formal part of the presentation. Now I want to add something more personal. We're, as scholars, we're usually minding our own business. And very, very rarely you find a scholar who not only ceaselessly insists to think about his or her field, but also force all of us around her to think about the field, to reflect about our academic fields, to think about borders, to stretch borders, to cross borders, not only disciplinary borders, but also these borders that we all, or most of us, accept without questioning, between scholarship and ethics, between scholarship and politics. And all this is an introduction to the fascinating topic of the lecture today, of Hindy's lecture today, Philosemitism and Antisemitism in Biblical Criticism. Hindy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to speak to Professor Yuri's center and to speak here again at Tel Aviv University. And I think I wanted to say just one word, which is not part of the formal text of the paper, and that is the critique that I formulated in graduate school, but I formulated in conversation with Ellie Friedlander and Paul Franks and two teachers at Harvard, so Hilary Putnam on the one hand and Stanley Cavell on the other. And I think part of what I do is very much shaped by a deep commitment that what we do in Madei Yahadut is always and already part of the humanities more generally. And that's the question, that I brought to my own field of biblical studies and more generally ancient Judaism. So just wanted to think with you in that context. I've never. This is the first time I've spoke openly and explicitly about this discourse of anti-Semitism in my field. So I do it with great trepidation, but I do it also very inspired by Scott Uri and his own courage to think about these issues here in Tel Aviv and globally. My paper today reflects on the history of biblical criticism and the place of biblical studies and Jewish studies more generally in the academy. I challenge the presuppositions today of what is, quote unquote, scientific about the study of Judaism, Wissenschaft des Judentums, of Hebrew language, and of the historical development of ancient Judaism as interpretive constructs that are burdened by a variety of forms of what I want to call parochialism, biases, and ultimately forms of racism as the othering of Judaism. And here I have in mind Simone de Beauvoir's account, who already spoke of the Jew as the other. At times this is explicit in the literature, and at other times less than discernible. I will begin with a rather personal introduction that perhaps can help situate my own critique of parochialism in the hope of trying to construct a kind of discourse that both acknowledges our own inevitable biases in the hope of reading in a manner that is critical but also generative. And here I have in mind work that Ellie Friedlander has done on hope with respect to Benjamin. The challenge for us today as biblicists, or more generally as philologists and humanists, is to build on the achievements of 19th century scholarship, standing, if you will, on the shoulders of giants, while engaging 20th and 21st century developments in the humanities, all along without forgetting the continuing vitality of Judaism long after its prematurely announced death. Like many scholars in Jewish studies, especially in Israel, it was in a religious environment that I was first taught to read biblical and rabbinic texts. That is, a particularity in religiosity which is closed off and insular with respect to a variety of critical and historical questions. But it is a reading that is vital to the tradition it works within, and ultimately it's future-oriented. Nevertheless, the constraints and impositions I felt were unsustainable for me intellectually. I felt deeply burdened by the traditional Jewish expectation that the study of ancient Judaism should be thoroughly canonical in its attitude towards texts, and should deploy anachronistic assumptions, seeing everything as an anticipation of familiar versions of Judaism that took hold in much later periods in the formation and crystallization of Judaism. And as the familiar story carries on, dissatisfied by the parochialism of a religious orientation to text, I pursued an historical, critical, and philological training in order to deepen and to problematize my own upbringing and background. I believed in this context I would find a new freedom. At its most sophisticated point, this view had become part of a paradigm whose methodology owed much to Weber. But many practitioners were less sophisticated than Weber in their uncritical distinction between religious and political ideologies that they ascribed to the producers of biblical texts, propaganda it's called, and the value-free pursuit of historical truth that they assumed for themselves. If I was to attain a more critical perspective on ancient Judaism, I would need to rethink the assumptions underlying Jewish anachronism, Protestant supersessionism, and post-religious scientism, and also challenge the truth-value distinction. And here I just allude to the really important contribution to my own formation by Hilary Putnam. I found that the tradition of Protestant Bible theology, still dominant within the academy, was no less problematic than the own parochialism that I carried with me from my own background. Its orientation was deeply supersessionist, and it had enshrined that attitude within a late 19th century view of ancient Israel's development that remained enthralled with Wellhausen. The dogma of source criticism and historicism were also deeply paralyzed by a perverse and hateful relationship with its past, that is, Judaism itself. But this now was integrated into the academy with a stamp of scientific authority. Protestant biblical theology was, and in some respects still is, deeply supersessionist, but also historicist. Here I'm actually challenging, both appropriating Jim Kugel's account of the Protestantization of biblical studies, but also saying that there's a larger context to think about historicism. So it's not only, it's about the period of time intellectually as well as a religious layer as well connected to Protestantism. This became a discourse that was inscribed not only among scholars trained in the Protestant tradition, but even and until this very day, many Jews and Catholics and atheists participate in and defend this approach as singular and definitive for their own reading practices without acknowledging the underlying motivation of this approach. The search for the earliest layer, the original Jeremiah or Jesus, the originary moment of divine utterance, were all privileged over and against any later developments in the history of the development of texts. It is precisely from reading the tradition, which was at once compelling and repulsive to me as a Jew, that I formed my own research trajectory. My teachers helped me along the way in manners that were full of guidance and risk. I had one teacher in this context who took unprecedented risks to expose the violence and the destruction that was essential to the first centuries of biblical studies, in particular, and then historicism more generally. And this was John Levinson, who had the courage to articulate precisely what I found paralyzing about the German Bible tradition of scholarship associated with the Old Testament and New Testament scholars alike. It was through his critique that I would find a pathway forward to write about this tradition today. I would say that for 20 years, more or less, I've been writing about new composition, that is rewritten Bible, shichtuv, or new forms of interpretive authorization, call it pesher, call it perush, call it divrei hayamim, and vitality of scripture. I'm borrowing a term from Gershom Scholem. It is only today that I want to say it was John Levinson who exposed, by the way, with tremendous critique and severe academic reproach from his colleagues, the darkest side of the critical method. He did this by exposing the uncritical embrace of historical criticism, which is riddled by an unreflective rejection of a past religious commitment and a new and exchanged religious commitment called science. He spoke extensively about the second conversion that peoples of faith assumed without fully understanding what was presupposed in the tradition of Protestant Bible theology. In Harvard as a graduate student, I encountered many people, mainly from Protestant backgrounds, who found a new religious belief in what they called science or critique. It was only later that I would meet many Jews who experienced the second conversion as well. For them, it doesn't mean that they necessarily left religious practice in order to believe in a new dogma, which perhaps we can talk about later. For them, the study of the Bible and of the ancient Near East was supposed to be an objective and dispassionate scientific discipline. Yet much of what they did consisted in an unsophisticated debunking of the naive beliefs to which they had formally subscribed, and their so-called scientific objectivity would have been regarded as outdated in other parts of the university. I might add that in that space of science, on more than one occasion, I was challenged for my own religious belief, as well as my colleagues who brought me the good news. In the spirit of trying to understand the history of the Hebrew language, the traditions of Mikra, and the context for the earliest formation and reception, which would come to be known as Madei Yahadut more generally, there was a systematic and even deliberate burial of Judaism. This Philosemitism was not about love, but about reappropriation, then dissection, and ultimately burial. It was actually an undermining of the spirit and nature of Judaism itself. The place of liturgy, the law, and the interpretive life of the text was understood as redundant and non-essential. The period after the creation of the law, after Josiah's reform, was no longer of interest. It became a bastardized form of an original Judaism or ancient Israelite religion. Even more than that was the ongoing and negative language that was used to describe and to characterize ancient Jewish texts and tradition. Expertise in Judaism was a waste of time. Midrash, medieval Hebrew poetry, mysticism, grammar. It was already and always over, and it was compromised now in a new Christian narrative. I was also exposed to the study of Hebrew, especially Proto-Northwest Semitic, as a study of forms, not meaning. And any interpretive efforts and energy was relegated to locating early and original context for biblical texts and traditions. As John Levinson pointed out, this discourse of the death of Judaism didn't end after the Holocaust. The discourse remained intact, and the search for the undermining and even what I would come to call the unreading of texts persisted. What continued to be remarkable to me is how Jewish studies scholars did not understand or appreciate the depth and the complexity of this new narrative that they accepted as their own. This was not only true of biblicists, but of rabbinicists or even of scholars of Kabbalah. I recall long conversations with biblical scholars about Wellhausen or Devetta, and the Protestant discourse or trajectory that continued to be part of what motivated the study of Old Testament, whatever you call it, Mikra, Hebrew Bible, Tanakh. Why would we continue to posit theories that were cutting edge 200 years ago in literary analysis? Why would we not continue to critique and consider new approaches that offered new pathways for reading and rethinking biblical texts? I understood from the very beginning of my own work, even as an undergraduate at Stern College, Yeshiva University, and spending some time in Revel Graduate School, and then, of course, at Harvard during my master's and PhD, that my intellectual future would lay elsewhere. I wanted to ask questions about the historicity of ancient scriptural and interpretive traditions without abandoning the very motivation that led me to study them in the first place: freedom. Without losing the sense that these traditions were deeply important because they remain vital up to the present day, and because they continue to shape and be shaped by the religious and intellectual worlds I inhabited. But I wanted freedom from both parochialisms, not just the first. The parochialism of historical critical method became increasingly transparent to me as well, so that the term Hebrew Bible was just another way of getting at an already and always determined trajectory which was not at all protected from the theological presuppositions of Judaism or Christianity. This was evident on so many fronts. What I would do is try to challenge these fronts directly by not debunking or disassembling, but by rebuilding and then ultimately suggesting new pathways. I'm now going to talk about some of the new pathways, but between part 1 and part 2 of the paper, I want to say that it wasn't always an easy road. The critique was not always well received, not by my colleagues and not by my teachers, and not even by my students. One front I took on was the canonical. As we come to understand that the function and organization of canon in ancient Judaism, we realize that there were many more members of the collection, what we mean by Tanakh, or if we want to consider the rabbinic corpus, texts that lie outside the normative collection or normative canon. And the collection, otherwise known as canon, had many different forms over time. Why, if this is not a theological project, would we privilege a canon of scripture in any shape or form? Why not allow any and all members that are cited or that participate in scriptural traditions to be part of this collection? Why not consider other texts, deuterocanonical or additional texts that we now know of from Qumran, amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls or the larger corpus? And here I have texts, for example, Ecclesiasticus, Ben Sira as one example, but there are many, many others. Ezra Revi'i, 4th Ezra or 2nd Esdras, of which I've written. Why would someone with no theological bias or privilege want to undermine canonical over non-canonical unless there was a theological justification? So I found myself working in canonical but also non-canonical or even marginal texts. I wanted very much to find a space to show the openness and possibilities of Judaism, but to do so in a manner that demonstrates what is vibrant in Judaism at the very same time that the discourse around biblical studies reported on its ending and closure with respect to spirit. I found partners in classics and German literature who helped me understand the ways in which these questions were being asked in their own disciplines. And it gave me perspective and strength to pursue this critique in my own work. I began to consider new ways of implementing philosophical and literary work to offer new paths for thinking about a vibrant and vital discourse about Judaism. I challenged intertextuality and source criticism with paths that had not been taken within our own field. And by way of aside, I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that one of the reasons why I turned to classicists and professors of literature was because I found no partners in Jewish studies or biblical studies. So I looked elsewhere for conversation partners. In addition to challenging the strictures of canon, I also tried to give an account of the ways in which biblical traditions expanded, a forward-moving discourse, instead of focusing on reconstructing earlier or more genuine layers. I understood all of the layers to be genuine. One such attempt was about trying to challenge the claim that there are early and genuine sources and later or spurious developments. As I spoke with Yedida about the very notion of a bastard with respect to texts that are marginal. So translating this concept of mamzer with respect to texts. What is a marginal text? I turned to Michel Foucault, who had characterized Freudian psychoanalysis and Marxist theory as discourses tied to founders, as a way of capturing a discourse whose continuity required unceasing references to a founding figure, so that what might be seen as innovation had to be presented and understood as attempts to retrieve what the founder really thought. I developed my own version of this idea, focusing on my first book in Seconding Sinai, calling it Mosaic Discourse, as a practice of thinking and writing and developing over several centuries, producing works such as Deuteronomy and Jubilees, or the concept of Halacha Moshe Sinai, and requiring a repeated return to the authentic teachings of the prophet. I mean, they're elsewhere, like there's a footnote in the book where I talk about Rambam and notions of Mishnah Torah. This is a discourse that continues in a forward-moving way. Such a practice, I argued, should be seen neither as proto-rabbinic nor as proto-Christian, but as anticipating aspects of both later forms of Judaism and Christianity, and in general as an early method for accomplishing that repeated revitalization that continues to be at the heart of scriptural communities, or as Alistair McIntyre calls it, interpretive communities. The argument, as I continue to believe, did not require a wholesale commitment to Foucault's philosophical or political views. What it required instead was the historicization of some of the central terms of biblical philology, terms such as rewriting, ascription, and samchut, authority. The result, I hope, is an approach that was at once more historicist than much of biblical scholarship, but at the same time more sensitive to the ongoing vitality of biblical traditions, both canonical and non-canonical. While Foucault was to some extent the muse of my first book, I subsequently came to understand that Foucault's insight into the historicization of authorship was anticipated by Friedrich Nietzsche, whom Foucault kind of acknowledges as an influence. I mean, it was a bit funny because the more I came to understand, Foucault actually, of course, absorbed Nietzsche and absorbed Barthes into his work without actually acknowledging him. So it was like another level of pseudonymous writing or pseudonymous attribution, if you will. So I turned to Nietzsche, who was initially trained as a classical philologist. And although Nietzsche's early work explicitly deals with the, sorry, to back up for a moment. So I thought about Nietzsche's inaugural address, Nietzsche offered a very sharp critique of Wolff and Wolff's account of his groundbreaking work on Homer. And I came to argue that Nietzsche's inaugural lecture had rich implications for the philology of ancient Jewish texts. This was not least because Wolff's methodological model was the equally groundbreaking work of not only Wolff, but also Johann Gottfried Eichhorn, especially his formidable introduction to the Old Testament, published between 1780 and 1793. Wolff employed the Alexandria Scholia, just as Eichhorn used the Masoretic Notes in order to trace developments in ancient practices of reading and editing, which both took to be a necessary prolegomenon to the preparation of a critical edition of an ancient text. I return then to the birth of philology into the intimate connections between traditions of Hebrew and Greek. And here I mean by philology a much broader category than the study of language and the reconstruction of an urtext. Both in the case of Eichhorn and Wolff, the return to the earliest layer and the recovery of the past was what I was challenging. To recover the earliest stage as privileged and as more important was to undermine the development of the text, and also was to impose expectation and anachronistic or untimely biases, which excluded the importance of pluriformity and development. The topic of Nietzsche's inaugural lecture was the Homeric Question. This was understood and is still understood to comprise two questions. How are we to identify and reconstruct the original Homeric text? How are we to identify and contextualize Homer himself as the original author? These, of course, were parallel to familiar questions about the urtext of the Pentateuch and the identity and context of the historical Moses. However, Nietzsche took a decisive step well beyond Eichhorn and Wolff by asking, was the person created out of a concept or the concept out of a person? He said this was the real question about Homer, or I would say about Moses or Jeremiah. For this radical move, Nietzsche was derided. He argued that the concept of a full-blown authorial personality was the product of a long development, which involved specific social changes. It came into its familiar form only in late Alexandria, and I tried to distinguish between two sorts of approaches to textual unities. First, scholars who tried to recover the urtext, or at least the archetype, and those who tried to recover the original author, or at least the original composer of a text. I wrote about this as a retrospective approach because its goal was to get back to the origin. And these scholars, my colleagues, continue to want to peel away the layers of copyist errors and editorial emendations and redactions in order to expose the original textual unit or units and to contextualize the original composers. Secondly was the approach taken by scholars who sought to trace various stages and factors in the formation of textual unities. This I wanted to call the prospective approach, since its goal was to trace the developments that led up to the textual unit in question. What scholars of the retrospective approach strive to strip away is precisely what the scholars of the prospective approach sought to study. Eichhorn and Wolff, on the one hand, took a prospective approach, but they did so only as a prolegomenon to the retrospective approach, which they still considered to be philology's ultimately objective. In contrast, Nietzsche argued for the intrinsic value of the prospective approach, which was for him no mere introduction. He proceeded to suggest a variety of stages in the development of the Homeric collection and the concept of the Homeric personality. And I'm going to skip a little bit of this now just in the interest of time. And I want to say here that that if we suspend the assumption that the personality came first and we look at the textual evidence, then we find, according to Nietzsche, that prior to the Alexandrian grammarians, there was very little conception of Homer's personality. And many texts were associated with his name. At the earliest discernible stage, it would seem that all heroic epics were ascribed to Homer and all didactic epics to Hesiod. So Nietzsche suggests that what came first was not the personality, but rather the concept, and in particular the concept of a certain genre. In the first place, the name of Homer stood not for a concrete person, but for the heroic epic. To ascribe a work to Homer in this period was to say that it was a heroic epic rather than a didactic epic. And later, some of these texts were excluded, since they were not of the highest quality and were considered imperfect instances of the genre. Only gradually, as some of the higher quality came to be read, and at least partially harmonized, did Homer come to stand for an author who had in representation a distinct personality. This personality reflected the unity of the text in question and also served as an idea guiding further harmonization and further textual production. Ultimately, this gave rise to a text collection and at some point to an ancient edition of this collection. Nietzsche concluded, "We believe in a great poet as the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but not that Homer was this poet. And the wonderful genius to whom we owe the Iliad and the Odyssey belonged to this thankful posterity. He, too, sacrificed his name on the altar of the primeval father of the Homeric epic, Homer." In other words, the great poet and wonderful genius deserving of study is not the actual historical Homer, assuming there was such a person. Even if we could find this original Homer, contextualizing him would shed little light on Homeric texts. The reaction to Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, was vicious, and the seeds for this disaster may already be seen in some of the more provocative aspects of Nietzsche's inaugural lecture. One unnecessarily provocative feature in his argument was that the prospective investigation responds to the real Homeric question. But in my view, both questions about textual formation and about stages of authorial formation are legitimate, and so are both retrospective and prospective approaches to these questions. I'm not trying, and I wasn't trying in my work, to repudiate the retrospective quest for the or text or for the quest for multiple versions of these. If we could find the original Moses or the original Homer, this would be extremely interesting, even if it would shed little light on Homeric texts, much of whose formation is connected to the concept of the personality. The same would be true if we could find the historical Moses, Jesus, Jeremiah, the priestly source, or the historical Ezra. My intention was to endorse the importance of the retrospective search for the original text and writer, while arguing at the same time for a prospective examination of traditionary processes in which both textual units and concepts of personalities are produced, redacted, and revised. So I've mentioned three things: problematizing canon, problematizing false attribution, and justifying a movement forward, what Sholem called vitality of scripture, as a way of understanding the growth and development of texts in ancient Judaism and beyond. It's important to note that the approach that I was recommending moved well beyond the distinction to what has come to be called old philology or new philology. If old philology was pioneered by Eichhorn and Wolff and Sussman and others, then ultimately what we want to do here is to reconstruct the original text or the author, and seeks as a second best to trace the history of distortions that have produced multiplicity since the early known archetype. The new philology then seems to know what we do know and seeks to determine what we can understand with respect to the physicality of the manuscript, the live hands or the hands of the scribal community by signs of correction, alternative, and the variations of form and object. The depth and richness of this engagement with manuscript is surely productive and illuminating. However, the worry that has been raised by people such as Gumbrecht or Bene is that the objectification of the text or textual tradition doesn't really change the problem with old philology. Old philology freezes the text in a reconstructed or imagined past, and new philology freezes the text in a single concrete manuscript or scroll, objectifying it in a particular manuscript. So how can we understand and exhibit the source of the text's dynamism of its life over time? I think this is pressing in the case of texts that enjoy at some point in time with some community scriptural authority. Here I want to quote from Benjamin's well-known essay, The Task of the Translator. The notion of the life and continuing life of works of art should be considered with completely unmetaphorical objectivity. Even in ages of the most prejudiced thinking, it has been suspected that life must not be attributed to organic corporeality alone. It's only when life is attributed to everything that has a history and not to that which is only a stage setting for history that this concept comes into its own. For the range of the living must ultimately be delimited on the basis of history and not of nature. Works of art are what they are in virtue of the distinctive way in which they matter within human life. Consequently, they are reducible neither to natural objects nor to mere instruments. They have a life, a history of their own, derivative from human life to be sure, but nevertheless their own life. Works of art have sometimes been said to constitute in a secular age a secular scripture, and we may accordingly transfer what Benjamin says to scriptures to texts that are what they are because of the way they matter, because of the authoritative role they play within a community's religious life. Scriptures are reducible neither to natural objects nor to instruments. They have a life and a history of their own. To this idea of an autonomous life, Benjamin relates translation, just as expressions of life are connected to the most intimate manner with living being without having significance for the latter. A translation proceeds from the original. Not indeed so much from its life as from its Überleben, its survival or its overflow or its excess of life. In other words, some texts may have an excess of vitality that express themselves in the fact that they provide the basis for translation, for new texts in languages other than the original text, texts that purport to say the same as the original text, although they are self-evidently different. I want to say the same about scriptures. Such texts have an excess of vitality that express themselves in the fact that they provide the basis for new texts. For example, and here I don't only have in mind translations from one linguistic register to another, but also pluriformity, that is, text that exists in a variety of different versions, even within the same linguistic register. They give rise to emulations that purport to say the same as the original scripture, although they are self-evidently different. Thus, texts such as the Second Temple Book of Jubilees or the Temple Scroll claim to say the same as various Pentateuchal texts, speaking in the voice of Moses or in the voice of the angel dictating to Moses, or even in the voice of God. Far from contradicting the authoritative status of Scripture, Jubilees or the Temple Scroll arise precisely from that authority. To acknowledge certain texts as scriptural is to recognize them as possessing an excess of vitality, to use Benjamin's language, more life than ordinary texts, and it's in the nature of life to generate life, to sustain and reproduce itself. Insofar as Scripture is authoritative, it is also generative. That which is generated by a scriptural text or tradition may be regarded as a dynamic textual unity, and these unities come in many varieties. All of this was work I did in a number of different iterations and publications to try to take biblical studies to a new place, which could both inherit the wisdom of historical criticism and the historical of scholarship, but also with an integration of the traditions of interpretation, growth of biblical tradition, and fundamentally an approach that was open to a vital tradition of Judaism and Catholicism without being co-opted by the parochialism of Protestantism, which called itself biblical studies. At the same time, I wanted to challenge historical critical thinking to continue to engage classics and literary theory, to consider paths of philology and literary analysis that stepped well beyond 19th century approaches. I had been troubled for a long time about generic categories that biblical scholars used, categories which I claimed obscure far more than they illuminated. In my 2014 book, Losing the Temple, Recovering the Future, I focused on a particular example of another kind of textual unity, which I called a constellation, drawing from the notion of constellation from Walter Benjamin and more remotely from that of Max Weber. 2 points made this notion particularly suitable for my purposes. First, a constellation expressed an idea, not a concept, and hence, in particular, not a concept of genre. A concept is a universal instantiated by particulars to which it applied in virtue of criteria that once settled could be put in the form of a definition. In contrast, an idea, as Benjamin used the term, is the determining ground of particulars, but it does not apply in virtue of criteria on which there could ever be any settlement. The explanation of an idea consists not in a definition, but rather in the presentation of an exemplary particular. And this was the case I used in my study of 4th Ezra. Not a set of criteria or generalizable features, but particular elements of a constellation in the exemplary particular that enabled one to employ the idea to illuminate other particulars. My goal was not to define the concept of a genre or a class of possible texts, but rather to illuminate an array of actual texts by means of an idea expressed by a constellation, which is to be found in an exemplary particular. Again, this is all my way of challenging later categories of generic terms or generic classifications that were created in 19th and 20th centuries and then set as kind of straitjackets to organize and locate ancient biblical texts. Secondly, the constellation idea illuminated a particular temporal dimension that made it especially useful, I thought, for the study of work that responds, as 4th Ezra does, to a cultural devastation that freezes the flow of time. The historical process is continuous and forward-moving, but when exploring history, our thought comes to a standstill because it has encountered, say, a constellation that interests it. And this is because the constellation in question already represents a standstill in the historical progress. And this standstill, in some ways, is still especially pertinent to us. To understand how a constellation represents an historical standstill is to explain or to take a significant step towards explaining our own thought. The case with which I was concerned was a constellation that represented the trauma of destruction and exile and the attempt to work through this trauma. Again, this was a deliberate corrective on my part. Instead of considering devastation and trauma to be the end of Judaism, I understood this as a narrative that was generative for the history of Judaism. In 4th Ezra, the very constellation about trauma and devastation enabled something to happen again by thematizing this discourse. It was to allow our own thoughts to go on. The constellation expressed what I called revelation inflected by destruction. Of course, many other constellations deserve studies, and there's surely other varieties. But my claim here, as opposed to Wellhausen, who argued for the death and end of prophecy, Sof HaNevuah, as a way of talking about the removal of spirit from Judaism into Christianity, I talked about ongoing claims that Sof HaNevuah was not the end, but the transformation of the revelatory. And I think I don't have time to develop this today, but to talk about Chacham Adif Minavi, as Elliot Wolfson and Boaz Chus and Fishbane and others have written about, is a way of understanding ongoing spirit without claiming that normative prophecy continued in later Jewish texts. It did require, however, that we challenge the ways in which 4th Ezra had been read by traditional historical critics, and to expose what was at stake with the claim that certain layers of the text were earlier than the others. And here I'm going to turn to a particular example, and I have many, of the way in which source criticism is used to cut up a text to reinforce a particularly supersessionist narrative. The text was used, that is, the text of 4th Ezra was used by Christian scholars to argue for a Judaism that died by 132 at the time of Bar Kokhba, and for an early and authorized doctrine of original sin. So much so that the parts of 4th Ezra that testified to a vibrant new revelation after destruction were considered spurious, bastard forms of the text, marginal, certainly not relevant to the original text. So E.P. Sanders, who has been considered a celebrated figure who's respectful and understanding Judaism and covenant, he distinguished between these parts of 4th Ezra that were naive and merely there to make the text palatable in Jewish circles, and the presumably more sophisticated elements that were genuine constituents of its unity. All of this organization depended entirely on Sanders' own theological assumptions. He assumed that according to a certain position, the righteous of Israel were saved, and this was far less sophisticated than one according to which the righteous of all nations were saved without regard to the election of Israel. While this is certainly debatable within theology, and it has indeed been debated in recent centuries, this differentiation was not an adequate basis on which to distinguish essential from accidental elements of the text. The idea that Israel had been chosen by God and that this election had special implications of some sort for salvation is generally assumed by ancient texts and indeed by early Christian texts. Sanders, however, linked the question of the unity of this text of 4th Ezra to the question of its authorship. This linkage had been assumed by many scholars working on 4th Ezra, whether by those who identify the author with Ezra, Michael Stone, or the angels with E.P. Sanders, or the split between them, Gunkel. Such approaches neglected two crucial points that emerged from the discussion of the pseudepigraphic strategy. First, the writer of 4th Ezra engaged in a deliberate act of self-effacement. Second, this self-effacement, along with elaborate portrayal of the protagonist's transformative dialogue with Oriel and his visions, was carried out for the sake of the intended reader's transformation. The point was to form a subject capable of receiving the renewed Torah in the wake of the temple's destruction. This perspective made it possible now to read 4th Ezra with all of its twists and turns as a single unity. When I speak of textual unities, I don't want to be misunderstood. These are not unities as totalities, because they're never complete. A discourse, for example, associated with Ezra has a long past and a long extended future. Textual traditions are generated by living individuals and communities who continue to imagine and reimagine them. This is true of practitioners, and it's true of scholars. All we have left from past lives are, in a sense, fragments, even when we have complete manuscripts. Philology seeks to reconstruct an abstract totality of which the remnant is a fragment. The philology that I envisage, on the other hand, seeks to reimagine that past life animated in the text in their dynamism, in their vitality, all the while acknowledging that our imagination can never fully revive the dead, and that our works must always remain fragmentary and untimely. I've turned to Friedrich Schlegel, one of the deepest thinkers, I think, about philology, who wrote, "Many works of the ancients have become fragments. Many works of the moderns are fragments from the moment of their emergence." His point was, of course, that all works are fragmentary, whether ancient or modern, whether physically intact or not, since their meanings depend in part on what is supplied by the reader. Instead of stating a thesis, however, in a way that would claim completeness, Schlegel ironically formulated an epigram that invited the reader to reflect and thereby enact the fragmentariness of the work. The development of philology over the past 2 centuries has broadened and deepened our understanding of ancient Judaism tremendously. And here I have in mind the work of people who have been thinking about philology in broad contexts, scholars that, of course, presuppose a linguistic and textually rigorous context, but also a context that re-embraces literary criticism and philosophical discourse about philology. So philology, prophecy, philology, poetry, and philosophy. In order to build on this progress, we now have exciting opportunities to learn, not only from the great practitioners of biblical and rabbinic philology, to whom we owe so much, but also from those who have practiced and theorized philology in other areas. The fragmentary remains of the past still exhibit their vitality by inviting our contributions. And this is, again, my critique. It's not about recovering the fragment and celebrating it as a frozen moment in time, but rather to understand an ongoing nature of what Sholem called vitality of Scripture. Through Nietzsche, Foucault, Benjamin, and Sholem, I sought to rethink and create new pathways for reading and interpreting Jewish antiquity that was alive to its future as well as honest to its past. These pathways were critical steps I took towards overcoming and directly challenging the very biases that I confronted within my own discipline. But there was one more step that I wanted to highlight today, and it was really the place of the Dead Sea Scrolls in our work as biblicists. The timing for my own early days of training and research coincided with the publication and public access, more or less, to the study of to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The work we're still doing today is to integrate them into biblical studies and into the study of rabbinics and Hellenistic Judaism, as well as the New Testament and early Christianity. This is a project which continues to be met with great resistance. These scrolls are relevant and essential to the way we now understand biblical studies. The scrolls have helped us challenge the boundaries between the canonical and non-canonical, normative and marginal, the sacred and the profane. The traditions of ancient Judaism are dynamic and alive to new possibilities and new ways of reading, thinking, and transformation, both of the past and of our own present narratives and self-understanding. My critique of biblical studies today and my various attempts to chart paths that were not taken are meant as a way to reintegrate biblical studies into the humanities. As I've argued today, at the time of the birth of the modern research university, there was fruitful interaction between biblical studies and classical philology, an area that served as an incubator in which the seeds for what would become distinct humanistic disciplines germinated. The situation today, however, does not suggest such reciprocity. To some extent, biblical studies is influenced by approaches in the social sciences and the humanities, such as the thematization of gender or performance and ritual. But biblical studies largely has pursued its own path, and there's no discernible flow from biblical studies to the humanities. In addition, I think an undeniable distinctiveness about biblical traditions renders them a locus of special interest and of methodological innovation. Because of ongoing roles and challenge to methodological innovation, because of the ongoing roles played by biblical traditions in Judaism, Christianity, and in Islam, these traditions have remained vital for millennia. They have been and remain central not only to scholarship, but also to people's lives in a highly distinctive manner. What's important in this context is not whether or not Scripture is holy, but rather the indisputable fact that millions of people have regarded it as holy or relevant. The temporal extent of cultural diversity of biblical vitality establishes biblical studies as a location where distinctive insights are possible. Some of these insights will be specific to biblical traditions, while others will be generalizable to other traditions focused upon by the humanities. An opportunity exists then at the present moment for the renewal of this reciprocity between biblical studies and the humanities. Meanwhile, the discipline of classics has entered a reflective moment in which it reconsiders its own history and its own methods of textual criticism. In literary studies, and after the ascent of so-called theory and its immediate aftermath, again, there's a renewed interest in what a title of a recent book calls Philology, the Forgotten Origins of the Modern Humanities. Can we move the field of biblical studies forward by using our own pasts, our dark pasts and light pasts, to critique and expose the presuppositions which are still operative in our own thinking and especially in our own training? Can we overcome our own parochialism, training, and particularism and allow the humanities to receive biblical studies and for biblical studies to be transformed and reopened through an engagement with new and radical thinking of philology, new and old models of literary theory and theological critique? Can we do this by carrying with us the parochialism of both biblical scholarship and the history of interpretation? Can we rethink the contours of commentary, interpretation, and composition as modes of vitality and integration, as an alternative to deadness and paralysis of a Judaism that gave up its spirit to another? This paper ends with a sort of hope instead of despair. We do not need to spend the next 25 years rehearsing critique of antisemitism or the insincerity of philosemitism, but neither do we need to repeat the methods and the perversity of our intellectual forebearers. Let us rethink paths that were not taken, as well as create new openings to read and rethink biblical studies. Thank you.